They judged him by his skin color and called him a liar. But what happened shut everybody up. Malik shifted uneasily in his seat, the vinyl creaking beneath him as the classroom buzzed with the muted chatter of unfamiliar voices. New school, new town, new everything. His sneakers barely touched the floor, but he kept them planted, heels dug in, as if to claim even the smallest bit of space for himself. The teacher, Mrs. Kelman, hadn't said much when she introduced him, just his name and a vague nod to starting fresh. No mention of where he'd come from. No encouragement. Just a flick of her hand toward the last empty desk in the back. He had learned not to expect much else. Take a second to subscribe. It really helps. Thanks. Now, back to the story. The stares were immediate. Some curious, some blank, some already sizing him up. He was used to that, too. The only black kid in the class. Again, he could feel the questions burning holes through his sweatshirt. Where was he from? Why'd he transfer mid-year? Did he talk like the rappers on YouTube? One girl, blonde with a tight ponytail, whispered something to the boy beside her, who smirked and leaned sideways to get a better look. Malik opened his notebook and stared at the blank page, pretending he didn't notice. He missed his old school already. It wasn't perfect, but at least there were familiar faces, friends who knew him, teachers who didn't look through him. Here he felt like static, like background noise. The lunch bell finally rang, and the classroom emptied quickly, groups forming without hesitation. No one waited for him. He walked alone to the cafeteria, weaving past lockers and bulletin boards plastered with announcements for events that felt like they belonged to another world. As he passed a group of boys near the vending machines, one of them called out, "Yo, new kid, you play ball?" Malik paused. "A little," he said, not really looking at them. The boy laughed. "Figures. You probably think you're the next LeBron, huh?" Malik forced a shrug. "Nah, my dad taught me how to handle myself." "Yeah? Who's your dad, anyway?" "Chuck Norris." He didn't smile. He didn't blink. He just said, "Yeah, he is," and walked away, leaving their laughter behind him like smoke in the hallway. Monday mornings meant show and tell in Mrs. Kelman's class. Usually it was stuffed animals, baby pictures, or some glitter-covered art project that still smelled like glue. The teacher used it to break the ice, help the kids feel seen, though Malik quickly figured out the spotlight wasn't meant for someone like him. Still, he sat quietly at his desk as the routine unfolded. Ellie showed off a dog-eared book she'd read 4 times. Jace pulled out a baseball signed by someone Malik had never heard of, and Sarah held up a glitter jar she said helped her calm down. Every item came with a chorus of oohs and polite claps. Then Mrs. Kelman cleared her throat. "Malik, since you're new, would you like to share something with us?" The classroom fell silent. He looked up slowly, eyes scanning the sea of half-interested faces. He didn't want to, not because he was shy, but because he knew how this would go. But something in him, it wasn't pride exactly, but close, nudged him forward. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a framed photo wrapped carefully in a soft flannel shirt. He placed it on the desk in front of him and turned it around. It was a picture of him, age 6, in a karate gi. Standing next to him, one hand on his shoulder, was none other than Chuck Norris. The real one. A pause, then a few murmurs. One snort of disbelief. Malik looked up. "That's my dad." The room broke into half-laughs, half-gasps. A few kids leaned forward, squinting. Jace raised an eyebrow. "You photoshopped that, right?" Malik didn't answer, just stared back, unflinching. Mrs. Kelman chuckled softly, clearly not buying it. "That's quite the imagination, Malik. Let's be respectful, class." He felt it again, that low burn behind his ribs. Not anger, not sadness, just that old familiar ache of being underestimated. Malik stood slowly, tucked the photo back into his bag without a word, and returned to his seat. The classroom moved on, but the stillness around him stayed. Later, when the bell rang, he could still hear Jace whispering to another kid as they left. "He's lying. Ain't no way Chuck Norris is his dad." But Malik didn't respond. He didn't need to. Not yet. Word spread fast. By lunch, half the cafeteria had heard about Malik lying during show and tell. The photo he'd brought, the claim about Chuck Norris being his dad, it had morphed into a joke passed from table to table. Some kids reenacted it with exaggerated voices. Others just pointed as he walked by. Malik carried his tray like it weighed 100 pounds, eyes forward, scanning for an empty table away from noise. He found one in the far corner, beside the janitor's closet, and sat without a word. Across the room, Jace was holding court with a group of boys who laughed a little too loud. Next week he'll say his mom's Beyoncé, he shouted over the buzz. Laughter erupted. One girl even covered her mouth like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Mrs. Kelman didn't help. When she passed him in the hallway later, she gave him that tight-lipped smile, the kind teachers give when they don't believe you but also don't want to deal with the fallout. By the end of the day, Malik had stopped trying to explain. Every time he opened his mouth, someone already had a snarky comeback waiting. It wasn't just that they didn't believe him. It was how quickly they decided he wasn't worth believing. When the final bell rang, he walked out slower than usual, his backpack slung low, the picture still tucked in the flannel inside. The halls buzzed with chatter, weekend plans, inside jokes, nothing that included him. Outside, the sun hit hard, turning the pavement into a shimmering blur. Malik sat on the low brick wall by the bus lane, waiting. He didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because he'd learned long ago tears only gave them more to laugh at. A shadow fell over him. "You know they're just jealous, right?" said a voice. It was Ava, the quiet girl from the second row. She wore oversized glasses and always drew anime characters in the margins of her notes. He looked up, surprised. "Jealous?" She shrugged. "My dad's an accountant. Yours is Chuck Norris. Real or not, that's cooler." Then she smiled, just once quick and honest, and walked away. Malik watched her go, heart thudding, just a little steadier. Maybe the day wasn't a total loss. Malik didn't say much when he got home. He kicked off his shoes by the door like always, dropped his backpack with a tired thud, and mumbled a greeting to his mom as he passed the kitchen. She looked up from the stove, brow furrowed, catching something in his voice he hadn't meant to show. "Everything okay at school?" she asked, turning down the heat on the burner. He paused, debating. "Yeah, it's fine," he muttered. "Malik." He stopped in the hallway, back still to her. She had that tone, the one that saw through everything. They laughed. He finally said, shoulders slumping, "When I showed the picture, when I said who my dad was." A long pause filled the kitchen. The soft simmer of the pot was the only sound. "They don't believe me," he added, quieter now. "Said I made it up." His mom turned off the stove completely, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and stepped into the hallway. "You know who your dad is. That's what matters." "I don't know him, though," Malik said, the words sharp but honest. "Not really. Just that one visit when I was little. And letters. And you telling me stories." She looked at him for a moment, her face soft but serious. "Do you think I would lie to you about something like that?" "No," he whispered. "Then believe me, baby. Your dad. He had reasons for not being around. Big, complicated reasons. But when he said he loved you, when he said he'd see you again, he meant it." Malik swallowed hard, his voice cracking. "But what if he doesn't come back? What if I just end up looking like a joke?" She knelt down beside him, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Then the joke's on them. Because you're stronger than they know. And your father, he's not the kind of man who lets a promise go." He nodded, slowly, the doubt still there but quieter. She pulled him into a hug and held on longer than usual. "Dinner in 10, she said, standing up and ruffling his hair. He didn't smile, but he held on her words like rope in a storm. The call came just after sunset, the sky outside Malik's window, stained with orange and violet, the kind of colors that made everything feel softer. He was in his room, curled up in the corner of his bed with his sketchbook in his lap, pencil dragging slow lines without thought. The page was already filled with half-drawn shapes, muscles, boots, a cowboy hat, and a familiar chin. It was the only way he knew how to quiet the noise. Then the phone rang. It wasn't the house line. It was his phone, the one he barely used, mostly for emergencies or rare texts from his mom. The screen lit up with a number he didn't recognize. He stared at it, thumb hovering over the answer button. He answered on the third ring. "Hello." A pause. Then a voice, warm and deep, filled the silence. "Malik." He froze. The pencil slipped from his hand, hitting the floor. "Dad?" he whispered, barely able to believe it. "Yeah, it's me." His heart beat, so hard it felt like it might crack his ribs. How do I know it's really you? Because the voice said, when you were 4, you made me promise I'd never forget the name of your stuffed bear. His name was Captain Fuzz. You made me swear it. Malik blinked hard, his eyes suddenly stinging. You did promise, he said quietly. I always keep my promises, his father said. There was another pause, not uncomfortable, just heavy with everything unsaid. I heard what happened at school, the voice continued. Your mom filled me in. Malik's throat tightened. They laughed at me. They didn't believe you were real. I am real, the voice said firmly. And I'm coming to see you. Malik's breath caught. When? Soon. I've got something to take care of first. But I'm not going to let them make you feel small. Not ever. I've been waiting, Malik said, voice cracking. I know, and I'm sorry it took this long. The line went quiet again, both ends holding the weight of years apart. I'll see you soon, son. Malik stared out at the darkening sky. Okay, he whispered. I'll be ready. Malik barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the moment again. His father's voice through the phone, calm and strong like nothing could shake it. A voice that had lived only in old photos and bedtime stories whispered by his mother now felt real, present, coming back into his life like a long-awaited sunrise. He kept the phone clutched in his hand under the blanket, afraid that letting go would somehow make it all disappear. By morning, the air in the house felt different. His mom noticed it first. She stood at the stove making eggs when Malik walked into the kitchen, his shoulders a little straighter, a quiet energy in his steps. You talked to him, she said without looking up. Malik nodded. He said he's coming. She didn't answer right away, just stirred the eggs with a slow, thoughtful motion. Do you believe him? Malik asked, his voice unsure. She turned then, her eyes soft. Your father doesn't say things he doesn't mean. But it's been years. He had his reasons. Some of them I don't even understand, she said gently. But if he says he's coming, he will. They sat at the table, breakfast mostly untouched. After a while, his mom reached into her purse and pulled out a small notepad and pen. She slid them across the table. Let's plan, she said. Plan. If he's coming, we should make it count. They spent the morning making a list, places Malik liked, things he wanted to show his dad, questions he wanted to ask. The list grew quickly. His sketchbook, the tree in the park he used to climb when he missed him most, the local diner with the best milkshakes. Then came the part that made his stomach twist, the school. You sure? His mom asked gently. Malik hesitated. Yeah, I want him to see. He didn't say what he really meant, that he wanted his dad to look that teacher in the eye, to stand in that hallway where he'd been laughed at. He didn't want revenge. He wanted to be believed. And this time, he wouldn't be standing there alone. The classroom buzzed with the usual chaos of a Wednesday morning. Pencils scraping, chairs dragging, laughter bubbling over half-finished worksheets. Miss Fleming stood at the front, her cardigan already slipping off one shoulder, tapping her pen against the whiteboard with mild irritation. All right, everyone, let's settle, she called out, but her voice barely cut through the noise. Malik sat near the back, his notebook open but empty, fingers tapping restlessly against the desk. He hadn't said much all week, not since the show-and-tell fallout. Most of the kids had moved on, but a few still whispered when they walked past him. He didn't flinch anymore, not since the call. Ms. Fleming clapped her hands once. Before we get into math this morning, I've got a little announcement. She tucked her cardigan back into place, smiled her usual tight-lipped smile. We'll be having visitors Friday. Some parents are coming to talk to the class about their careers, part of our Career Pathways Week. It's informal. They'll just share what they do, maybe answer a few questions. A hand shot up near the front, Trevor, of course. Like when Madison's mom brought her real estate brochures and talked for like an hour. A few kids laughed. Ms. Fleming gave him a warning look, but didn't disagree. Hopefully a bit more engaging this time. Malik sat up straighter. His palms had started to sweat. Ms. Fleming glanced at the paper in her hand. We've got a dentist, a firefighter, and, she squinted, a martial arts instructor? Oh, she looked up slowly, her eyes finding Malik. For a moment, the room was silent. Malik held her gaze, not defiantly, but with something steadier. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. Oh, I see, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Malik, that must be your father? He gave one small nod. Some kids turned, a few whispered. Trevor let out a short snort, but didn't say anything. Well, Miss Fleming said, setting the paper down, I suppose we'll all see Friday. Malik looked down at his notebook again. For the first time in days, he wrote something, just one word. Finally, Friday morning arrived with the kind of buzz that only a school assembly or pizza lunch could rival. The classroom, normally slow to wake, hummed with anticipation. Students whispered across rows, leaned over desks, and swapped guesses about which parent would be the coolest, the weirdest, or the most boring. Malik sat at his desk, quiet, focused. He wore a simple navy polo and jeans, but there was something different in how he sat, shoulders straighter, chin up. He hadn't said much to anyone that morning, but his eyes kept flicking to the clock. At 10:05, the knock came. Miss Fleming, standing by the projector, glanced toward the door like she'd forgotten what day it was. Ah, yes. Right on time. She crossed the room, heels clicking faster than usual, and pulled the door open. Gasps whispered through the room before anyone said a word. Standing there wasn't just a visitor. It was him. Chuck Norris didn't need an introduction. The name carried weight, but it was his presence that silenced the room. He stepped into the classroom wearing a button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, calm as a breeze but with eyes that held years of storms. A few kids' mouths fell open. Even Trevor slouched back into his chair. Ms. Fleming blinked. Mr. Norris? He smiled politely. Yes, ma'am. Malik's father. He said it clearly, evenly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He scanned the room, eyes landing on Malik for a second. The boy didn't flinch. He smiled just a little, the kind of smile that said, I told you so, without needing to say anything at all. Well, Ms. Fleming cleared her throat. We're very pleased to have you. Would you, like to begin? Chuck nodded once. He stepped forward, hands in his pockets, and began to speak about discipline, about focus, about how being strong wasn't about throwing punches, but standing up when it mattered. Every eye was locked on him. Even the walls seemed to listen. And in the back row, Malik sat still, heart full. Not because the class finally believed him, but because he never needed them to. The bell hadn't even rung before the room, filled with noise, louder, sharper than usual. Kids clustered in corners, circled desks, whispered too loud to really be whispers. Malik walked in behind Chuck, head high but nerves dancing under his skin. The day before had been a blur of shock and silence, but today felt different. Today, everyone had seen the truth. He made it halfway to his seat before the first voice cut through. Yo, Malik, that was Chuck Norris? Malik gave a small nod, sliding into his chair. Like actual Chuck Norris? Another asked, practically bouncing. The guy from Delta Force? My dad watches that all the time. Man, I thought you were just messing, someone added. But you really meant it. Malik didn't respond right away. He just pulled out his notebook, tried to ignore how his fingers still trembled slightly. It wasn't fear, it was energy. Like every emotion from yesterday still hummed under his skin. Why didn't you just say something earlier? Came another voice, so casual, so easy. Like yesterday hadn't happened. Like no one had laughed, or mocked, or doubted. He looked up, eyes scanned the room. Trevor was slumped at his desk, not looking at anyone. For once, he was the quiet one. Malik's voice came out softer than he expected. I did. The room stilled a little. Just enough. I told you who he was. You laughed. He wasn't angry, just tired. You didn't believe me because I don't look like him. Because he's white and I'm not. Because Chuck Norris as my dad didn't fit your picture. Silence grew in the space around his words. Then, slowly, one of the girls in the back said, That's kind of true. We all made assumptions. A few nodded. Some stayed quiet. But the weight of yesterday hung in the air, undeniable now. Malik turned back to his notebook. He didn't need an apology. He didn't need a crowd. He'd spoken his truth. And this time, no one laughed. In the corner of the room, Ms. Fleming stood by the board, her face unreadable. She didn't interrupt. Maybe she finally understood the lesson Malik had taught better than any test ever could. It was Malik's idea. Not his dad's, not his mom's, his. After all the talking, the looks, the whispers that followed him like a shadow down every hallway, he decided it was time to tell the whole story. Not to defend himself, Not to brag, but to set the record straight. Ms. Fleming wasn't thrilled at first. She shifted in her chair when he asked to speak during morning announcements. "It's a sensitive topic, Malik," she said, folding her hands too tightly. "We don't want to make things worse." "Exactly," Malik replied. "That's why I have to say it myself." The principal agreed, probably because Chuck had come by and shaken his hand the day before. Everything changed after that. So the next morning, with his backpack still on and his voice steadier than he felt, Malik stepped up to the front of the class. The chatter stopped almost immediately. Every eye turned toward him. Phones weren't allowed, but a few kids were already reaching for them anyway. "I know a lot of you didn't believe me last week," Malik began. "I said Chuck Norris was my dad, and you thought I was lying. Some of you laughed. Some didn't say anything, but still looked at me like I was crazy." His eyes swept the room. Trevor was there, looking down at his desk. Ms. Fleming stood near the door, arms crossed tight, lips pressed together. "I don't blame you for not knowing, but I do blame you for how you acted." That caught them. He heard someone shift in their seat. One girl sucked in a breath. "My dad adopted me when I was 3. I don't look like him, but I am his son. And just because someone's skin doesn't match yours, doesn't mean they're lying. You don't get to decide someone's truth by looking at them." He paused, then said quietly, "Now you know. So next time, believe someone. Or at least listen before you judge." He stepped down. No cheers. No applause. Just silence. The kind that means something just landed and no one knows what to do with it. Malik didn't need them to clap. He just needed them to hear him. And they did. After Malik's words, the classroom didn't return to normal. Not really. The silence that followed his speech was a different kind of quiet, like the whole room was holding its breath and trying to understand what they just heard. Even Ms. Fleming didn't jump back into the lesson plan. She stood by the window for a long time, her face turned away, thinking. Trevor was the first to move. Not dramatically, not with a big speech or some grand gesture. He just walked over to Malik's desk at the end of the day, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, eyes low. "Hey," he mumbled. "I was a jerk. I didn't believe you, and I made it worse. I'm sorry." Malik looked at him for a second, then nodded. "Thanks." They didn't shake hands. They didn't become best friends. But something shifted, something honest. Later that afternoon, as the final bell echoed through the halls and backpacks zipped shut, Miss Fleming asked Malik to stay behind. He hesitated, but didn't argue. She sat at the edge of her desk, her voice softer than usual. "I owe you an apology, Malik. I laughed that day, and I didn't stop it when I should have. I didn't listen." Malik shrugged, but it wasn't a careless one. "A lot of people didn't." She nodded slowly. "It's no excuse, but I've been thinking about why. About how quick I was to dismiss your story because it didn't fit what I expected. That's not who I want to be, not as a teacher, and not as a person." He looked at her, trying to measure her sincerity. "So what do you want to do about it?" She smiled gently, like she was proud of the challenge in his question. "Start by changing, listening better, teaching differently." For the first time in a week, Malik didn't feel like he was carrying a weight all alone. He walked home lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because something had finally broken open. And now there was space for things to grow. Not just for him, but for all of them. The video had only been online for 2 hours when it started making the rounds. A 6th grader named Luis had posted a shaky clip of Chuck Norris stepping into the classroom, calm and composed, just moments before he addressed the students and turned to face Miss Fleming. The caption read, "Kid said Chuck Norris was his dad." No one believed him. Then this happened. By dinner time, it had racked up over 20,000 views. That night, Malik sat on the couch, half watching cartoons while his phone buzzed nonstop beside him. Texts from classmates, comments from strangers, reposts from people he didn't even know. He didn't know how to feel about it. Part pride, part nerves, part not really knowing what came next. His mom sat beside him, arms folded, frowning as she scrolled through her own phone. "This wasn't what we planned," she said finally. "You okay with this?" Malik didn't answer right away. "I guess," he said. "I didn't do anything. It's not like I asked for this." "No," she said gently, "but you stood your ground. And that matters." At school the next morning, things were different. Not worse, just louder. Kids who barely noticed Malik before were now whispering his name in the halls. A few offered fist bumps. One asked for a selfie. Ms. Fleming's classroom door had reporters waiting outside by noon. The principal had to escort them off the premises. In the teacher's lounge, Ms. Fleming sat at a table with her hands folded, watching the footage replay on a colleague's tablet. She didn't speak. She didn't defend herself. When the clip of her laughing played, her jaw tightened and her eyes lowered to the floor. By midweek, local news anchors were discussing it like it was the feel-good story of the month. They all loved the twist: celebrity dad, bullied kid, classroom redemption. But no one talked about the part that mattered most, the moment before Chuck walked in. The part where a boy had stood alone, surrounded by laughter, still believing in his own truth. That part, Malik knew, would fade fastest. But it was the part he'd never forget. The following weekend, Malik stepped onto the playground of Eastbrook Elementary not as the quiet new kid, but as someone the whole community now seemed to know by name. A banner fluttered above the gates. "We stand with Malik." Below it, folding tables brimmed with baked goods, lemonade pitchers, and stacks of handmade signs reading, "Believe kids," and "Respect all stories." It had started with a few parents reaching out to the school. Then local businesses pitched in. A barber offered free cuts for kids all month. The neighborhood bookstore put Malik's face on a young leader's poster. Even the librarian, who rarely cracked a smile, had written him a note on a sticky tab, now tucked in his backpack. "You spoke up. That's brave. Never stop." Chuck stood quietly by the gate, ball cap low, trying not to attract too much attention, but it was no use. Adults kept approaching, some just to shake his hand, others to thank him for what he'd said in that classroom. But he deflected every compliment, always steering the praise back to Malik. "My son did the hard part," he'd say. He told the truth when it wasn't easy. Inside the gym, a mural was being painted on one long white wall. Students had outlined the shape of a classroom, and in the center, a child stood with his hand raised. Beside it, someone had started lettering a quote: "Never be afraid to tell your story, even if your voice shakes." Malik watched from a bench, legs swinging slowly above the gym floor. It was strange to feel seen. Not stared at, seen. Like people finally noticed more than just the color of his skin or the classroom seat he sat in. They saw the person inside the story. When a little boy from first grade ran up and handed him a drawing, stick figures of Malik and Chuck standing tall above a group of smiling kids, he didn't know what to say, so he just smiled and nodded. Later, when the speeches ended and people began to head home, Malik looked up at his dad and whispered, "I think I get it now." Chuck raised an eyebrow. "Get what?" "What it means when you say, some days you fight with fists, other days with truth." Chuck nodded, voice low. "And both matter." The Monday after the community rally, something had shifted inside Eastbrook Elementary. It wasn't just the posters still hanging near the office or the cautious, lingering glances from staff who used to rush by Malik in the hallway. It was something quieter, more permanent, like a building learning how to breathe differently. Principal Gaines stood in front of the morning assembly with a clipboard in one hand and her voice steady, if slightly tight. "Starting today," she announced, "we're launching a new student-led initiative. It's called Voices Matter. Every student will have time, space, and support to share their story. No filters, no judgment." The students murmured among themselves. Malik sat near the back, unsure what to make of it. He didn't want to be the face of something. He just wanted to feel normal. But normal didn't come easily after what happened. That afternoon, the fifth grade class returned from lunch to find a suggestion box newly mounted on the wall, painted in bright reds and blues, with the word "Speak" stenciled across it in thick, bold letters. Below it, a laminated sheet explained the rules. Write anything. Be honest. Be heard. You are not invisible. Mrs. Alder had a new tone in her voice, too, softer, less rushed. She stood in front of the class and said, "I owe all of you a better version of myself. So today, instead of our lesson plan, we're starting with stories. If anyone wants to talk, this is your time." For a while, the room stayed still. Then, one by one, hands started to rise. A girl shared what it felt like to always be the only one in her family picked up late. A boy talked about moving 4 times in 2 years. No one laughed. No one whispered. They just listened. Malik didn't speak that day. He didn't need to. He sat there, watching his classmates lean into each other's truths with a kind of attention they hadn't practiced before. And for the first time since the teacher's laughter broke something in him, he felt like the wound had started to close. Not because people felt sorry, but because they finally understood. And maybe that was how real change began. Not with one apology, but with 1,000 quiet moments of listening. By spring, Malik no longer sat in the back row. He still liked the quiet, but it wasn't about hiding anymore. It was about comfort, choosing peace instead of being pushed into the shadows. He walked the halls differently now, with shoulders that didn't fold in and eyes that didn't scan for the next insult. And people saw it. During recess, Malik ran the basketball court like he belonged there. Not the best player, not the loudest, but the one who always passed the ball, always looked out for the kid who hadn't gotten a chance yet. He'd become something nobody expected back in September. Steady. Trusted. Mrs. Alder had changed, too. She no longer dismissed small hands when they rose with big ideas. She called on Malik by name now, and when he answered, her smile wasn't stiff. It was genuine. Well said, she'd tell him, and it no longer sounded like she was surprised. One morning, she asked him to lead the morning question. "You don't have to," she added, "but I think they'd like to hear you." He said yes, heart pounding, but voice calm. He stood at the front of the class, chalk in hand, and wrote on the board, "What's something about you nobody sees right away?" The room was silent at first. But then, like the suggestion box weeks ago, voices started to rise, timid, then stronger. A quiet girl admitted she wrote poems at night. A boy confessed he hated scary movies, even though he pretended he didn't. Laughter followed, warm and kind. Malik didn't share his own answer until the very end. He turned back to the class, cleared his throat, and said, "People used to think I was lying when I talked about my dad. And yeah, he's famous. But the thing nobody sees right away is that I didn't need him to show up for me to know who I am. I already knew." The class didn't clap. They didn't need to. They just listened, still and open. That day, Malik didn't just speak. He was heard. Fully. Finally. And he walked back to his desk, not as the new kid, not as the kid with the famous dad, but as Malik. And that was enough. Chuck stood just outside the classroom door, leaning slightly against the frame, arms crossed. He hadn't meant to stay. He was only there to drop something off for Malik. But the moment he heard his son's voice carrying across the room, strong and sure, he stayed rooted in place. He watched through the small window as Malik finished speaking, standing at the chalkboard with one hand in his pocket, the other gripping the chalk like it anchored him. The room was still, every student watching, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. That was the difference. Respect, earned the right way. Chuck's throat tightened as he saw the boy. His boy, take a breath, give a small nod, then walk back to his desk, calm and steady. There were no dramatic reactions, no applause, but the air had shifted. The kind of silence that settles after something true is spoken. When the bell rang, Chuck stepped back just enough to blend with the crowd of parents arriving early or kids pouring into the hallway. Malik didn't spot him at first, chatting easily with one of the boys who used to ignore him. He looked different. Same hoodie, same backpack, but more grounded. Lighter somehow. A weight lifted. Then he looked up and saw Chuck. His face broke into that crooked half-smile he used to do as a kid, the one that always started with one corner of his mouth before the rest followed. He walked up, casual but quick, and handed over a folded piece of paper. "Forgot to give you this," he said. "It's the volunteer form for the community day thing." Chuck took it without looking. "You crushed it in there," he said. "Not too loud, not too soft. Just enough." Malik shrugged. "Just talked." "No," Chuck said, shaking his head slightly, his voice low with quiet fire. "You stood up, son. That's bigger than talking." They started walking down the hallway together. No cameras, no reporters, just father and son. And for once, Chuck didn't feel like the Chuck Norris. He felt like something far better. He felt like Malik's dad. And that was the greatest title he'd ever carry. Ms. Greaves stood in the empty classroom long after the final bell rang, staring at the words Malik had written on the board that morning. "Don't judge my story by the cover you didn't take time to read." It echoed louder in the stillness than anything she'd said all week. She'd erased a lot of things over the years, wrong answers, old reminders, doodles and margins, but she couldn't bring herself to wipe that one clean. The room smelled faintly of dry erase markers and chalk dust, familiar and sharp, grounding her. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, suddenly feeling the weight of every dismissive glance, every comment she hadn't meant to sting, every time she'd let her own assumptions fill in a kid's story instead of asking. Malik had cracked something open, not just in the class, but in her. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. Not angry, not bitter, just honest. And beneath all the noise of her shame and guilt, there was gratitude. The knock came soft against the doorframe. She turned to see Malik, lingering with his backpack slung low, his father standing a few steps behind. Chuck gave a small nod, as if to say, "This moment is yours." "Malik," she said, surprised. "I thought you left already." He shrugged. "Forgot my sketchbook." A beat passed. "It's on your desk," she said, then hesitated. "Thank you for what you shared today." He nodded, but didn't speak. She took a breath. "I need to say something. Not for show, just for truth." Malik looked up, eyebrows slightly raised. "I was wrong," she said. "About you. About a lot of things. I judged too quickly, and I didn't listen. That's not the kind of teacher I ever wanted to be." Her voice cracked just slightly. "But I want to do better." Malik studied her, then walked to his desk. He picked up the sketchbook, flipped through it once, and looked back at her. "Then start with the next kid," he said gently. "And don't wait so long next time." She smiled, tears stinging at the corners of her eyes. "Deal." The school gym buzzed with anticipation, folding chairs lined in tight rows, every seat filled with students, teachers, and parents. The bleachers creaked under shifting weight, conversations low and curious, echoing off the high ceilings. A banner hung above the stage. "Respect, truth, and community. A new chapter begins." It was Principal Alvarez's idea, but the heart of it had come from Malik. He sat in the front row now, beside his dad, Chuck, who looked entirely out of place in a sea of restless kids and clapping staff. Yet somehow, he blended in effortlessly, wearing a quiet pride that made the moment bigger without ever trying to. Principal Alvarez stepped up to the microphone, his smile calm, but his voice full of purpose. "Today's assembly wasn't always planned," he began, "but sometimes the most important lessons don't come from the curriculum. They come from courage." The crowd quieted. "We've seen the headlines. We've read the stories. But here at Ridgeview, we live them. And when a student speaks truth, when a classroom becomes a mirror, we listen." He gestured toward Malik. "This young man reminded us all that names carry power, and that assumptions can be heavy when unfairly placed. And today we get to hear not only from him, but from the man who raised him with strength, humility, and integrity." Applause broke out as Chuck rose from his chair. Malik gave him a quick look, a mix of nerves and awe. Chuck patted his shoulder, stepped up to the mic, and let the room settle. "I'm not here because of who I am on a screen," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here because of who my son is off it." Silence felt like respect. He told his truth, not to impress anyone, but to be seen. That's bravery. That's strength. And if a school can be a place where kids like Malik are heard, where teachers are willing to grow, and students feel safe to speak, then that's the kind of school I'd want for every kid in this country. The room exhaled as one. Applause swelled, not because Chuck Norris stood on their stage, but because something real had. And this time, everyone was listening. After the assembly, the hallway felt different, less noisy, more thoughtful. Students lingered at their lockers, not out of boredom, but because something hung in the air they didn't want to let go of just yet. Malik walked slowly, backpack slung low, still feeling the warmth of Chuck's hand on his shoulder during the applause. He wasn't used to being noticed for the right reasons. Now, he could hardly take a step without someone stopping him. "Hey," said Jordan, a tall kid from homeroom who had never spoken more than 2 words to him before. "What you said about truth. That was brave, man." Malik blinked. "Thanks," he replied, not sure what else to say. More students came up, some quietly, some with excited energy. A girl from debate team told him she was writing a piece about bias in schools and wanted to quote him. Another student admitted he always felt out of place and had never told anyone, not even his parents. Malik just nodded, heart swelling with something he wasn't used to, being heard. Later that afternoon, Principal Alvarez invited a few students to join a special roundtable in the library. "We're starting something new," he explained. "A space for student voices. Malik, I'd like you to be part of it." Malik hesitated but nodded. The library had always been a quiet place for him. Now, it would become something louder, something meaningful. When the group gathered, it was a mix, students from different grades, backgrounds, cliques. What they had in common was the desire to speak and to be listened to. A girl named Priya shared how her name was constantly mispronounced, even after correcting it a dozen times. A boy named Eli opened up about the shame of being the only kid on free lunch in his grade. Malik didn't have to lead the conversation. He just had to be there and listen. The bell rang before they were done, but no one rushed out. Outside the library, Malik leaned against the wall, exhaling. He didn't need the spotlight, didn't want it. But now that he had it, he understood something new. Being seen wasn't just about proving yourself. It was about making space for others to be seen too. Weeks passed, but the echo of that day never really faded. It seeped into the everyday rhythms of the school, in quiet ways at first. A new sign went up in the front hallway. "Respect all stories." Simple, but it meant something. To Malik, it felt like a soft kind of justice. Not loud, not showy, just true. Ms. Fletcher started her literature class differently now. Instead of jumping into lessons, she began each week with a story circle, letting students share something, anything about their lives. It wasn't mandatory, but almost everyone spoke. She never interrupted, never corrected, just listened. And that made all the difference. Even the cafeteria, which once felt split by invisible lines, seemed less divided. Malik found himself sitting with new faces, kids he used to just pass in the hallway. They didn't always talk about what happened. Sometimes they just shared fries, traded jokes, or silently scrolled through music. But something had cracked open, and no one was rushing to shut it again. Principal Alvarez pushed forward a new school-wide initiative called Voices First. It encouraged students to lead conversations about equity, respect, and representation. Malik and a few others were asked to help design it. They met on Wednesdays, sometimes after school, sometimes over lunch. Not every idea made it through, but each one was heard. That mattered more. And then there was Ms. Cameron, the teacher whose laugh had started it all. She hadn't vanished from the school like Malik thought she might. Instead, she stayed. Quieter now. She didn't flinch away from him anymore. In fact, she often nodded when their paths crossed. Once she even smiled, small and sincere. She started attending the roundtable sessions in the library too. Not to lead, just to listen. Malik still had hard days. There were still stares, sometimes still moments when people's assumptions try to press in. But he carried himself differently now. Not because he had something to prove, but because he finally believed what his dad always said, "You don't have to be loud to be strong." Change didn't roar through the school like thunder. It settled in slow, like roots beneath the concrete. And for the first time, Malik knew, this time, the change was going to last. The auditorium lights dimmed slightly as Principal Alvarez stepped away from the microphone. A soft murmur filled the room, students shifting in their seats, teachers settling into the front rows, a few parents lining the back wall. Then came the quiet cue. Malik stood slowly from his seat, hands only slightly shaking as he adjusted the folded paper in his grip. He wore a simple navy sweater, jeans, and a pin on his chest that read, "Your story matters." As he climbed the steps to the stage, the noise fell into stillness. He took a breath. "Hi, I'm Chuck Norris. Some of you know me. A few of you maybe just know my name because of what happened." The words came slow at first, measured. His voice wasn't booming, but it was steady. "True, I didn't come up here to talk about who my dad is. I can talk about who I am. Because for a long time, I didn't think that was enough." He looked out at the crowd, not at any one face in particular, but the way someone scans a skyline. "I used to think that people had to see me do something big to believe in me. That if I told them something about myself, I had to prove it. Prove I belonged. prove I was worthy. But I've learned something lately. You don't owe anyone proof of your story. You don't have to change yourself to fit into a space that wasn't made for you. A few heads nodded in the crowd. Malik's hands were still now. When someone laughs at your truth or doubts your worth, it says more about them than it ever will about you. And yet it hurt. It hurt a lot. But I'm still standing. Not just because my dad showed up, but because I realized I didn't need to shrink myself for anyone's comfort. He paused, then added softly, and if anyone here has ever felt that way, like you don't belong, I want you to know, you do. You always did. There was no applause yet. Just silence. The good kind. The kind that means people are feeling something too big to clap for just yet. And in that quiet, Malik smiled. Just a little. But it was real. The email came late on a Tuesday afternoon, buried beneath homework reminders and school updates in the district's inbox. At first glance, it seemed like spam. A short subject line, Student Advocacy Honoree Nomination. But when Principal Alvarez opened it, her eyes widened. She read the first paragraph twice, then called Malik's mother. By Wednesday morning, the news had started to spread. A national education nonprofit, the Center for Youth Empowerment, had selected Malik as one of 5 students across the country to receive their Rising Voice Award, given to young people who turned personal challenges into public change. The press release landed on the school's homepage before noon. Then the local paper called. Then the city station. And by Thursday, an email from a national morning show producer arrived, asking if Malik and his father would be willing to appear for an interview. The media attention came fast, but Malik met it with quiet calm. His father stood beside him through most of it, gently deflecting praise when interviewers tried to steer the spotlight toward him. "This isn't about me," Chuck said plainly. "This is about a young man who had the courage to speak truth with grace, even when it hurt." At school, students began asking for his advice. Some slip him notes with quiet thank yous. A few teachers started quoting parts of his assembly speech in class discussions. The once invisible boy who'd sat near the back now found himself walking hallways where even the shyest kid gave a nod. And still, Malik stayed grounded. He told his mom he didn't want a party. He didn't want balloons. He just wanted things to matter, not just for a week or a headline, but for the next kid who walks into a classroom with big dreams and a name no one believes yet. One afternoon, his English teacher stopped him after class. "You know," she said, "in 20 years, I think I'll still remember what you said up there on stage." Malik smiled. "Me too," he replied, "because that wasn't just for them. That was for me too." National attention didn't change Malik, but it did something even more powerful. It amplified a voice that had always been there, one the world was finally ready to hear. The celebration wasn't big. Malik wouldn't have wanted it that way. No balloons, no hired venue, no streamers spelling out national recognition. Just close family, a few of his favorite neighbors, and the smell of collard greens and mac and cheese curling through the house like a familiar hug. Aunt Lacey was the first to arrive, carrying a peach cobbler with a foil barely clinging to the top. "For my baby boy," she grinned, pulling Malik into a hug before he could even greet her properly. "They finally see what we've known all along." Malik chuckled, a little bashful. "It's not a big deal." His cousin Marcus nearly dropped his plate. "Not a big deal? You're on TV, bro. You got grown folks quoting you like you're Barack Obama's long-lost nephew." Laughter rippled through the kitchen. Chuck leaned in the doorway with a glass of sweet tea, his usual quiet calm softening at the edges. He watched as Malik moved from guest to guest, accepting hugs, answering questions, brushing off praise with a smile that only widened when he thought no one was looking. Later, as the sun dipped low behind the backyard fence and conversation shifted to old stories and new dreams, Malik slipped out to the porch for air. Chuck followed a few minutes later, sitting beside him on the worn wooden steps. They sat in silence for a while, just listening to the hum of voices and music drifting from the open windows. "I ever tell you how proud I am of you?" Chuck asked, his voice low. "Only like 100 times this week," Malik grinned. Chuck smirked. "Good. You keep hearing it. Because you didn't just speak up, son. You stood tall, and you stayed kind." Malik looked down at his hands, fingers tracing the grain of the wood beneath them. "Sometimes I was scared." Chuck nodded. Courage doesn't mean you're not scared. It just means you go forward anyway. Malik leaned his head against his father's shoulder, just for a moment. The kind of moment that doesn't need a camera or a trophy to mean everything. Just a porch, a quiet evening, and the understanding that family is where celebration begins and where it always comes back. The house had quieted, guests gone, dishes stacked neatly in the sink, and the scent of cobblers still faint in the air. Malik sat at his desk in the small corner of his room, fingers resting on a blank page in his notebook. Outside, the wind whispered through the branches, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't sound like pressure, it sounded like possibility. He stared at the page for a while, unsure how to begin. So much had changed, not just in his school or in the headlines, but inside him. The kid who used to lower his voice when speaking in front of strangers, who hesitated before raising his hand in class, now found himself invited to speak in places he'd only seen on TV. But fame was never what he wanted. What he wanted was change, real, lasting change. He finally started to write. Not a speech, not a thank you, just thoughts, ideas about what could be different in schools, how teachers could be trained to listen better, how classrooms could be safer for kids who looked like him, how his story shouldn't have to be an exception. It should be the rule. Downstairs, Chuck sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, reading over an invitation that had arrived that morning. It was from a national education summit asking him and Malik to attend as guest speakers. He didn't need to say yes immediately. He'd let Malik decide. Later that night, Malik wandered in, notebook tucked under his arm. "Hey, Dad," he said, rubbing his eyes. "If we go to that summit, can we talk about other kids too? Not just what happened to me." Chuck looked up from his mug, smiling. "I was hoping you'd say that." They sat together, flipping through Malik's notes, talking about ideas, not attention. Justice, not applause. It wasn't about revenge or vindication anymore. It was about the future. One Malik wanted to help build. As the clock ticked past midnight, Malik closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. The past had shaped him. The pain had pushed him. But what came next? That was his to write. And he was ready. Spring came quietly, soft and green, and with it, a sense of something settled. At Westbridge Elementary, the once drab hallway near the front office now held a new mural. Bright strokes of color, handprints of every student, woven together in a design shaped like an open book. Above it, in clean block letters, were the words, "Every story matters." The school had changed, not overnight, but steadily. Teachers sat through new training that focused on empathy, cultural awareness, and active listening. A new mentorship program had been launched, pairing older students with younger ones, helping build bridges where walls had stood. And once a month, an assembly called Voices in the Room invited students to share parts of themselves that didn't always show up in report cards. Music, poetry, traditions, truths. Malik's name came up often, but not like it used to. Now, it wasn't whispered with disbelief or with that sideways glance kids give someone after a moment of controversy. Now it was said with respect, with pride. Sometimes, a younger student would ask him for advice before a presentation, or just sit by him at lunch because they'd seen him speak with courage and kindness. Ms. Parker stayed on, but different, transformed in ways subtle and sincere. She no longer saw her classroom as a place to control, but a place to understand. She kept a photo on her desk now, not of her class, but of that day Chuck Norris stood in front of her, quiet but undeniable. A reminder, she said, of how easy it is to forget what people carry until you ask. At home, Malik was still the same kid, still leaving socks on the floor, still groaning at early alarms, still asking for just 10 more minutes of video games. But in his chest, there was something stronger now. A foundation, built not just from his father's shadow, but from his own steps. Chuck never bragged. He didn't have to. He watched his son with that quiet pride reserved for people who know how hard the road really was. The boy who stood up in a room full of doubt had become a voice for those still finding their own. That was the legacy, not the fame, the faith, the future.